Welcome to video number 8, Immanuel Kant and the Categorical Imperative, one of my absolute favorite rock bands, of course. In our previous video, we looked at what I call Aristotle's arrow. Most other people call his concept of the golden mean. And the reason we looked at that is because you know this. When we are trying to resolve an ethics dilemma, we're going to do critical thinking. It's systematic. It can calm us down. It shows us the way forward. And part of critical thinking is being comprehensive, pulling in several legitimate different points of view and seeing if maybe there are hints that could help us resolve the dilemma we're facing. Aristotle gave us one of those hints, one of those tools, one of those potential ways forward with his arrow. Immanuel Kant is going to give us, I think, an equally interesting idea called the categorical imperative. And again, pulling Kant into helping us resolve an ethics dilemma is part of good critical thinking. It's comprehensive. So, what are the big ideas of our 8th video here? One is going to be talking about Immanuel Kant and his fascinating take on the consequences of our actions. For me, this was mind expanding when I encountered it, and it still fascinates me. I hope it lives up to that billing and you find it interesting as well. We're going to look at a school of ethical thought called deontology. If you want to talk the ethics talk, you got to know about deontology. And finally, just like Aristotle gives us Aristotle's arrow, the great Immanuel Kant is going to give us the categorical imperative. So, Immanuel Kant is one of the big names in philosophy. He's German. He was born early-ish in the 18th century, 1724, and I think lived to the ripe old age of 80. Don't trust me on the dates here, but I believe he lived till 1804. Was born and lived and died in Königsberg in Germany at the time. It's part of Germany that was ceded to the Soviet Union and now Russia at the end of World War II. One of the reasons Kant is so revered in philosophy was the scope of his achievements. We're only going to look at one. I'm qualified maybe to talk about only one, and that's his contributions to ethics, and particularly a school of thought called deontology, and in particular the tool that he gives us for your management toolkit, the categorical imperative. Now, a key background point in Kant that I spoke about in the last slide that I just found mind expanding and kind of liberating is our second bullet here, consequences. Kant says, get this, don't make a decision based on what you think the consequences will be. Don't make a decision based on what you think the outcome will be, because the consequences, the outcome, are unknowable. The projected consequences, Kant says, are an inferior way of making an important decision, what you think the outcome of your decision will be. As I say, that was kind of liberating for me. Imagine you're in an ethics dilemma and one of your colleagues is saying, well, we can't do action Z because that would lead to... And of course you would listen to them, but you could say, well, let's think like Immanuel Kant for just a moment. Let's put our Kant hats on, and we know that consequences are unpredictable. They're unknown. So they're not a good basis for making a decision. Probably all of us can think of, I certainly can. I won't tell you fascinating stories from my life for once, but we all can think of instances where we did what we thought was right based on the consequences we projected and were shocked to discover that's not the way it shook out at all. So there may be some traction to Kant's idea here. Okay, if we don't make a decision based on the consequences, what's our basis for making the decision? Kant says our basis is the concept of duty, D-U-T-Y, duty. And that's the big idea with Kant and his ethics. Kant says in an ethics dilemma, we identify our duty and we do it. Kant says to live an ethical life, we identify our duty and we do it. And Kant is one of those guys that says if we want to have any chance of being happy in life, we have to be ethical. So identifying what our duty is, if we're thinking like Kant, becomes very important. And it leads to this big school of thought in ethics theory, one of the biggest schools of thought in ethics theory, called deontology. Deon is the Greek word for duty. Ology means the study of, so deontology is the study of duty. And Kant is like the poster child for this. He's the big guy. He's the coach of the deontology team. He's going to lead us to this thing called the categorical imperative, which is his tool for teaching us what our duty is. But he wants to talk about the hypothetical imperative first, because he says that's what most of us do. And the hypothetical imperative is basically thinking like this: I should do action Z because it will lead to these consequences. You can see the problem there for Kant. I should do action Z because it will lead to these consequences. Kant says you don't know what the consequences will be. So, in Kant's book, hypothetical imperative, bad. Categorical imperative, good. So let's have a look at that. I wish I could read German. I had to learn it to get my doctorate in English, and then, shame on me, promptly forgot it. Because Kant is difficult for me to read in English. I've tried several different translations, and I almost hate to quote Kant. We're going to, but it gets kind of ponderous. So here we go. Let's talk about what a categorical imperative is. It's a duty. It's something that we have to do. We have to follow to be ethical. And we want to be ethical because we want to be happy. And Kant is going to give us this really cool way of identifying the categorical imperatives that surround us. But first, in talking about duties, again, which are just sacred to Kant, he says a moral law, in other words, a duty, states categorically what ought to be done, whether it pleases us or not. Some duties are going to be unpleasant, just like the way forward in some ethics dilemmas are going to be unpleasant. So let's go to the big question here. How do we know what our duty is? We're coming up on this wonderful tool that Kant is going to give us. And here's Kant in translation again. So act that the maxim of your will could always hold at the same time as a principle establishing universal law. Here's what he's trying to say, and we'll come at this again in another slide. Imagine that the solution that you're planning for your ethics dilemma, imagine that maxim, imagine that action became a universal law, that everybody had to do the same thing. So let's say your solution to an ethics dilemma is you're going to tell a lie to get yourself out of trouble. I'm sure I've done that. Kant would say, okay, imagine now that the universal law is every time everybody gets in trouble, they tell a lie. Your action just set the universal rule for everybody for the rest of time. And he says, hey, step back and think about how that might feel. He's going to be a lot more specific, but that's the big chunk of his categorical imperative, of his way of discovering what a categorical imperative is. This will be more clear in just a moment. Kant's going to give us 3 questions to ask to establish a categorical imperative. But before we get there, something that he feels very strongly about, and It's just another attraction of Kant for me. I hope for you as well. Look at this last point on this slide. So act that you use your humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means. What he's trying to say here, I will be your Kant translator. He's saying you can never use a human being as a means to an end. Not maliciously, at least. You can never use a human being as a means to an end. He says that human beings are sacred, that they are ends in themselves. Human beings are not means. And he's going to work that into the 3 questions he gives us for a categorical imperative. One more quick take on Kant and his positioning of human beings as ends and not means. He says fairly directly for him, I'm proud of Kant here, sexist language, but man is a person and not a thing, and therefore not a means. There is nothing more sacred in the wide world than the rights of others. They are inviolable. So as strange as Kant may strike us with some of his ideas, there's this attractive bedrock that I find attractive, at least, and I think may appeal to many of us. Here at last is the categorical imperative, Kant's way of identifying the duties that we need to honor to be ethical and to be happy. The categorical imperative starts with the identification of actions. So in dealing with an ethics dilemma, you'll see different potential ways forward. Pick the best one. Let's call it action X, the one that appeals to you most, just to your gut. And you say, I'm thinking about action X to solve my ethics dilemma. Kant's going to ask you 3 questions about that action, and maybe the other actions you're proposing as well. Would the world function if everyone did action X? And he really means would it function? If it wouldn't, he's talking about a breakdown of civilization when he means, when he's talking about malfunctioning here. So would the world function if everybody did this? Second, even if the world would work, would I want to live in a world in which everyone did action X? Well, if we get an answer of no to either question 1 or question 2, Kant would say we don't have a categorical imperative. The world wouldn't work. You can't universalize this. Even if we could, this isn't the kind of world you want to live in. Clearly, this is not a categorical imperative. It's not a duty. But if we get answers of yes to those first 2 questions, we're well on our way to saying, you know what, we've identified a duty here that we need to honor. Look at question number 3, though. Here comes Kant's human beings can never be a means. With action X, am I intentionally and detrimentally using a human being as a means to an end? And here you're hoping for an answer of no. If the answer is yes, then again, this clearly is not a duty. So you ask yourself these 3 questions. I think one of the strengths of the GEN model for ethical decision making that we're going to plug this amazing idea into is it gives us an action X. The first question in the GEN model, we'll get to this later, but I want to show you how relevant Kant is to the GEN model. The first question in the GEN model is, should I fill in the blank? And so, should I do action X? So we've, using the GEN model, we've already got our action X question to plug in to Kant's categorical imperative. Let's do a quick example here in hopes of clarifying this. I hope you'll remember the case study I trotted out in our first lecture, and it involved firing someone who didn't deserve to be fired, ostensibly in order to save money or to clarify the power relationships within a particular company. So, I'm thinking about action X to solve my ethics dilemma. I'm thinking about firing this individual. Let's look at Kant's questions. Would the world function if everyone fired people, if every boss fired employees who didn't deserve to be fired? Would the world function if every boss fired an employee who didn't deserve to be fired? Would the world function? Yeah. The trains would still run on time. There wouldn't be rioting in the streets. Yeah, okay, the world probably would function. So we got a yes there. Question number 2. Even if the world would work, would function, would I want to live in a world in which every boss fired an employee or employees who didn't deserve it? Well, please think for yourselves, but no, I don't want to live in a world like that. And I should use the sound effect of screeching tires right here because the door just shut. I answered no. I don't want to live in this world. This cannot be a categorical imperative. I have identified something that I don't want to see universalized. But let's go ahead and look at action at number 3. With this proposed action, firing someone who doesn't deserve to be fired, am I intentionally and detrimentally using a human being as a means to an end? Heck yes. I'm firing this poor guy to save money, ostensibly. If you remember the case study, I'm firing this guy if that's the decision I'm firing him to clarify the power relationships within that magazine and that corporation. Clearly, he's being used as a means to an end. If Kant could sit down with us on this one, he would say, well, keep thinking. Don't know what you're going to do, but you can't fire him. That's clearly not a duty. That is clearly not a categorical imperative. For obvious reasons, I hope, Kant's philosophy, at least in ethics, is also called universalism. Because he's saying, take the action you're contemplating and universalize it. Imagine everybody had to do that. Would the world work? Would you want to live in that world? And just an extension of that, he's saying, don't make yourself an exception to a rule that you want everyone else to follow. Again, imagine telling a lie because you're in a tight spot. Imagine your proposed solution is to tell a lie. And you work that through the categorical imperative. Would the world work if everyone told lies to get out of trouble? I don't know. Probably. Let's give it the benefit of the doubt. Yeah, it would still work. Do you want to live in a world where everyone lies to get out of trouble? No. We don't want to live in a world like that, probably. And so if you lie, you are making yourself an exception to a rule that you've universalized, a rule that you want everyone else to follow. So there's universalism. Deontology we've already talked about. It's also called non-consequentialism. I hope for obvious reasons. Kant is saying, don't worry about the consequences. Don't think about consequences. Okay, there's something here we have to talk about. Kant is saying this is just a contradiction, no pun intended, a contradiction within Kant. And Kant scholars have just said we just have to live with this because the tool he gives us here is so wonderful. But you may have already spotted that Kant is saying, pay no attention to consequences. And his first question in the categorical imperative is, hey, if everybody did this, what would happen to the world? He's asking you to think about consequences. If you spotted that error, pat yourself on the back and just remember that. I can't remember who said it. One sign of intelligence is the ability to hold two antithetical ideas in your head at the same time. Kant gives us a wonderful tool here with the categorical imperative, but it's built on a wobbly foundation, I think. Kant has told us that we have to do, I'm looking at the third bullet now. Kant has told us that categorical imperatives are non-negotiable. If we identify our duty, we have to do it, period, case closed, whether we want to or not. Wow. He says that some things that we identify as duties cannot be done all the time. A duty that can be done all the time is a perfect duty. And that's the big categorical imperative with Kant. A perfect duty, like telling the truth, is one we have to do all the time. And Kant would tell the truth all the time. More than one ethics scholar has said, so imagine Kant were alive in the Netherlands in World War II, and someone came up and said, hey, do you know where Anne Frank's family is hiding? Kant could keep his mouth shut, but he couldn't tell a lie. He would not be able to say, never heard of her. No, don't know her. Imagine he does know where she is. I'm saying this is very hypothetical, but it illustrates his point. And that's how seriously he takes this. A perfect duty cannot be violated. It is a categorical imperative. He gives us a little bit of wiggle room. There are imperfect duties, things that we can't do 100% of the time. We wish we could. An imperfect duty is a wonderful duty, but it's a physical impossibility to do it 100% of the time. And examples over the years, Kant gives the example of giving to charity. If we gave to charity all the time, we would wipe ourselves out, and we would enter those charities and as a recipient and no longer be able to give to them. So he says there are some limits. And another one, modern critics have pointed out, is donating blood. As much as we may want to do that, there are just limits on how often we can do that. So an imperfect duty is a wonderful duty. We wish we could do it all the time, but it's a physical impossibility. Kant's concept of the perfect duty is troublesome to many of us, certainly to me, because of how rigid he was about that. Again, if you've promised, you have to honor the promise. You cannot tell a lie. Imagine that you've promised to meet me at that pizza joint near the Edwards campus. And I made you promise. I said, okay, but you got to be there at 7 p.m. You promise? You go, yeah, I promise. So you're on the way to meet me at that pizza joint, and there's an accident nearby, and you're trained in first aid, and you could stop and render assistance to somebody who really needs it. But darn it, you promised me you would be there at 7 p.m. That's a perfect duty. You've got to keep your promise. You see the problem here, and it's one of the complications with Kant, because he was a hardliner on that. Somebody who gives us some wiggle room in that is a wonderful 20th century British philosopher, William David Ross, W.D. Ross. And he gives us the concept of prima facie duties. And he's directly addressing this idea to the troublesome nature of Kant's perfect duty. So if you're leading your team through an ethics dilemma and you get to Kant and they know about perfect duties and they say, wait, we have to do this all the time, you might want to fall back to W.D. Ross's prima facie duty, because again, he developed this specifically in response to the difficulties with Kant's perfect duty, Kant's non-negotiable categorical imperative. And let's go to the bullets here. Ross loves Kant, but he disagrees with him on this. And so instead of perfect duties, the categorical imperative, Ross gives us the prima facie duty. And look at this. I'm at the first smaller bullet. Prima facie duty, it's an always important duty, and here's our escape clause, provided that no other reason or set of reasons is weightier in a particular situation. And in this quote, he addresses the example I gave you. If I have promised to meet a friend at a particular time for some trivial purpose, Hey, you were meeting me for pizza, but okay, trivial purpose. I should certainly think myself justified in breaking my engagement if by doing so I could prevent a serious accident or bring relief to the victims of one. There's a very useful escape clause and a philosophically legitimate one. Um, uh, Ross doesn't believe in perfect duties. He believes in prima facie duties, which are almost perfect duties. We honor them. Our intent is to honor them 100% of the time. But if within a particular situation a higher duty arises, we are ethically allowed to pursue that higher duty. And then just if you're interested, Ross is a good writer. He says his prima facie duties are fidelity, faithfulness, reparation, reciprocity, gratitude, justice, beneficence, non-maleficence, what a fun word to say, and self-improvement. He says those are his. There might be more, there might be fewer, there might be different ones for you. But let's end on this wonderful note. Kant has given us a wonderful tool, the categorical imperative, the concept of the perfect duty, and W.D. Ross has come up with, I think, a brilliant way to inject a little bit of flexibility into that concept of the categorical imperative and the perfect duty.